Hello, everyone. This is Rick Thomas, and I am reviewing The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, the podcast series from Christianity Today. This particular episode is titled The Aftermath, and this is Mike Cosper as he details the aftermath of Mark Driscoll's resignation from Mars Hill Church. Mike Cosper interviews an eclectic group of folks who talk about the heartbreak, the turmoil, the fear, as well as the practical matters of finding new churches, finding new jobs, finding new relationships. He also talks about reconciling relationships that were broken because of the toxicity and the authoritative culture of Mars Hill. Meanwhile, Mark Driscoll pops back up in Arizona as he rebranded and relaunched himself as though nothing happened. So in this review of the rise and fall of Mars Hill, again, it's titled The Aftermath, I want to speak to 5 essential takeaways that I trust that all of us can learn, that we can apply to ourselves personally, as well as humbly assessing our own church cultures and our leadership. Thank you so much for joining me for these reviews. This probably will be the final review that I will do. This is the final one they said that they would do. There will probably be some bonus episodes they mentioned later on down the line, but I have done 14 reviews now, including some bonus episodes that they have done. This will probably be, again, my final one, and this is what they called the aftermath. Now, before I get into the 5 takeaways from this podcast that I trust that we can apply to our own lives, I do want to give you a brief episode summary. Basically, this episode is a post-mortem on Mars Hill Church. It's a reflective podcast as Mike Cosper talks to many of the members of the various campuses. And as you listen to the podcast, it's 2 hours long. You're going to hear various voices as they talk about how they see things differently now, that there has been some distance between themselves and Mark Driscoll. And it is true that hindsight typically provides clarity, and that's an essential thing that we should all understand when coming through a traumatic event. It is impossible to see things clearly when you're in the middle of a difficult time. Time and space provide an opportunity to understand, hopefully with biblical insight and application toward personal transformation. It's so easy to become caught up in the hysteria, the numbers, that the church is growing, the results, and even accept things that you would not ordinarily agree with if things were different. And I had mentioned in several of these reviews how pragmatism had gripped so many people that they were caught up in the hysteria. They were caught up in the numbers, the results, the things that God was doing. And they were tacitly thinking about and maybe even dismissing some of the bully culture, the manipulations that was happening at Mars Hill. But now that time and distance has happened, the bully culture, the manipulation, even the bully and the charisma that Mark Driscoll has and the force in which he led people, many people did fall prey to it. And so they talk about that in this episode, The Aftermath. Here's probably the key takeaway for me. And toward the end of the podcast, someone said something like this. I'm going to paraphrase it. But the person who believes that they are not susceptible to the manipulators or the manipulative cultures, they have already opened themselves up to the possibility of being part of a cult because of their blindness to the potential of being susceptible to it. Once you say you're not susceptible, you've already moved closer to it. Now, I may have mentioned in some of these episodes that I was part of a culture that was very similar to Mars Hill Church, and that was Sovereign Grace Ministries. Sovereign Grace Ministries, or what they now call Sovereign Grace Churches, was a toxic, authoritative, heavy-handed church culture with many abusive pastors that were leading several of these local churches. I was part of one of these abusive churches under an abusive pastor. And so as I listened to these different people talk in this interview, It all resonates with me. I have been there. I have experienced many of those things, and it is really painful. And I just can't say clearly enough that if you think that you're not susceptible to this, then you have already inched toward it in some way. We need to be on guard. I am not talking about being cynical. I am not talking about being suspicious of every church leader in every church. That's not the attitude that we want to have. But with humility, we want to be discerning about the things that are happening in our various church cultures. So without cynicism and without suspicion, but with discernment and humility, we want to be able to assess what's going on in our churches. And so that's a brief episode overview or a summary of what they talked about in this 2-hour podcast. Now, I want to mention 5 things that I drew out of it, and perhaps you could think of other things if you listen to it, but here are my 5 things. The first thing, and I'll just mention these in the order in which Mike Cosper presented these ideas in the podcast, but he opened this episode talking about a pastor who was platforming Mark Driscoll after Mark left Mars Hill. And this pastor, I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want to. I don't want to mention the church because just shame on this pastor for what he said. He said basically that we should not judge Mark Driscoll, but we should restore him. And he used Galatians 6:1 as his proof text. You're probably familiar with this verse. It says, if any person is caught in sin, you who are spiritual should restore them in a spirit of gentleness, keeping watch on yourselves, lest you too be tempted. This was a horrible thing for this pastor to say. And really what he did is he twisted the Mars Hill narrative, and he made Mark out as a victim. And Mark quickly claimed that mantle of being a victim. And so shame on that pastor for platforming Mark and giving him a place to be able to communicate in the way in which he did. There were 2 problems that I had with what this pastor was doing by platforming Mark. The first one is Galatians 6:1. The implication is that the person that you're restoring wants to be restored. If a doctor is going to operate on a patient, he needs a patient who wants to be a patient, but that is the problem. Mark Driscoll doesn't want to be a patient. Mark Driscoll doesn't want to be restored. And so you can't restore someone who doesn't want to be restored. And that is apparent up to this point with Mark Driscoll. So that's problem number 1 with him platforming Mark and playing him as the victim and Mark accepting that mantle. And then the second thing is the whole idea about restoring. Restoration should be about mending a broken soul. Mark Driscoll is broken internally. He has soul trouble. But restoration in view here is about restoring him back to ministry. And I do not believe that Mark Driscoll should be having any public ministry in any iteration, whether it's pastoring or podcasting or writing books or YouTubing or any other way of having a public ministry. This is not the time to be talking about that. And so this pastor did a huge disservice to Mark Driscoll and his family, to his own church. He's perpetuated something that's continuing from Mars Hill Church. And so this idea of restoring Mark Driscoll, it is a huge problem because 1, Mark doesn't want to be restored, and number 2, he shouldn't be platformed at all. The second takeaway is that Mike Cosper told the story about a young man who saw an advertisement of sorts about an anniversary that Driscoll's church in Arizona was having. And so this young man took it upon himself that this is an invitation for me to go down there and actually confront Mark, or maybe it would be better to say to appeal to Mark Driscoll to make things right with this young man's dad. This young man's dad was part of Mars Hill Church, and and he was abused and manipulated and bullied by Mark Driscoll, and it really just created a tension and a friction and a separation between them. And so this young man went down to the Arizona church that Mark is leading now after he rebranded and relaunched himself. And then after the service, he appealed to Mark. He confronted Mark and appealed to him that, hey, would you make things right with my dad? That conversation ended. They separated. Up to this point, Mark Driscoll hasn't sought out to reconcile with this man. But the point that I want to make under this point here is the young man's attitude that was so striking to me. He talked about the problem with Mark Driscoll. He talked about what Mark Driscoll did to his dad. He talked about a few other Mars Hill pain points, but he did not come across as bitter and angry. And to me, that was phenomenal, that whatever he had to work through, he had worked through it. And that is really the goal for all of us. That is the attitude that we want. We don't want to sweep these things under the rug. We can't do that. But there is a goal in mind. And it's kind of what Joseph said in 50:20 of Genesis. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is the place where we want to come to. Now, as I say these things, I don't say this to shame any person who's trying to recover from what happened to them in their abusive situation, whether it's Mars Hill or some other abusive culture or abusive individual, because I know that you just can't flip a switch. It took me more than 2 years to work through the abusiveness that I was under while part of Sovereign Grace Ministries. And so I know that you just can't shake yourself and be better. It just doesn't work that way when you're part of an abusive situation. And so when I talk about this person's good attitude as he reflected on what happened to him and his dad, I don't mean that to shame any person who is still working through what happened to them, because it's just not that simple to do. However, it is crucial to talk about the bad things from our past and then examine how we talk about it. Because if we talk about it in a bitter way, or if we talk about it in an angry way, we still have work to do. And I was just stricken by how this guy was talking about what happened to him. And again, that is the goal for me. That is the goal for anybody that's been in an abusive situation. So I thought that was quite remarkable. Number 3, I want to talk about social media. The first decade of this century saw the rise of social media and those individuals who took advantage of social media for good and evil. Now, I am not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I use social media. Many of you do as well. But the first 10 years of this century, we saw Mars Hill Church, Mark Driscoll. We saw Sovereign Grace Ministries, the Gospel Coalition, Together for the Gospel, many celebrity preachers, and they grabbed the hearts and minds of the church. In many ways, the first decade of this century was a wild and messy time. And again, I'm not saying that everybody that uses social media is wrong, but because it can be a means of grace, we can also take good things, flip it on its head, and use it in evil ways. But here's the point. We're not victims to this media. We choose to access social media, and we can promote good things, bad things, good people, bad people. And so each one of us needs to self-assess to discern. And here's a point that I would like for you to discern. Is your affection for the local church growing stronger or weaker? Is your affection for your church leadership growing stronger or weaker? Or has there been ministries or celebrity preachers that has supplanted the affection that you should have for your local church? And so I would just encourage all of us to think about our social media diet. And if it is moving us into the local church and giving us greater affection for the local church, then maybe we're on a good track. Our ministry is a parachurch organization, but we have no desire whatsoever to supplant the local church. As we like to say in our ministry, that all roads lead to the local church. We are a supplemental ministry. We want to help local churches to be better at doing what God has called them to do. We do not want to replace local churches at all. At this ministry, we have a high view of the local church, and we want to use social media as a means to elevate the local church. And so that is a call for all of us. Has social media got in the way? Has it reduced your affection for the local church? Has the celebrity preacher taken the place of your pastor? If you were to look at my podcast stream that I listen to on my phone, you will find no pastors, no celebrity preachers at all. I don't listen to, and I rarely listen to any celebrity preachers. Sometimes people will send me a sermon and I may listen to it, but I have a pastor. We have 2 teaching pastors, and it takes me all week to process the message that they present on Sunday morning. And so I want that message to go from short-term to long-term memory, and I want to saturate my mind in the message that the pastor preached. Sometimes I will do a podcast on that message. Sometimes I will write an article on that message. I want to work it into my soul. I'm not opposed to celebrity preachers, but God has called me to a specific local church, and I want that church to be the main diet that I receive as far as my sanctification from a ministry is concerned. But the first decade of this century, I do think that we were wild and messy with the proliferation of ministries that took advantage of social media. And all of that was not bad, but we need discernment as we think about how these ministries are impacting our lives. Number 4, one of the interviewees talked about Mark Driscoll's effect on other Christians, particularly men in the church. Now, Mark Driscoll had this uber, over-the-top, masculinity-centered authoritarianism, and that's the way that I describe it. Maybe there's other ways that you can describe it, but he was wrong. It is true that men should lead their families. There's no question about that biblically, that though we're all equal in Christ, there's a hierarchy as well. But Mark Driscoll took that to a place that the Bible does not. And it affected many of the men in the church, which meant it affected many of the wives in the church, and it impacted families. It just went downstream in a toxic, manipulative way. And that's what one of the interviewees was talking about, is the effect of Mark Driscoll on specifically the men of the church. And you don't have to think too long to discern Mark Driscoll's personality, his brazenness, his boldness, his winsomeness, his crude language, his bully teaching style. Here's the appeal that I would want to make to you and me, is that as leaders, we have an effect on other people. A leader is a shaping influence. It cannot be any other way. We become some version of our leaders. We take on their views in part. We can take on their personalities, their tones, their preferences. The herd mentality is a good thing. Let that statement sink in just for a moment. The herd mentality is a good thing when the herd leader is humble and other-centered. We are the herd, the body of Christ. We have a herd mentality. God made us to be part of community. There is a communal instinct in us, which is what I'm calling the herd mentality. But Mark Driscoll was narcissistic. And so either you can become part of a Christocentric community, or you can become part of a cult. And then finally, the 5th takeaway is one of the keys to working through a traumatic season in your life is to talk about it with folks who can help you. The point of counseling is for broken people to have someone to speak with to work through what happened to them. Now, of course, there are concerns about how we speak, when we speak, where we speak, and why we talk to a person about what has happened to us. I have shared in another interview my reasons for not recommending this podcast series from Christianity Today. And what I said was I don't recommend it for some. I caution others about this series format. What I am for, though, is that we don't sweep this under the rug, that we do talk about it, but where, when, why, and how we talk about it is important. And my caution about this podcast series is the triggering effect it can have on people who are still working through it. I do not know how much time and investment you have in the abuse culture, people who have been abused, but I've spent a lot of time working with abused people, and I understand from this series that it can have a triggering effect, and so that was my caution, but I am not saying in any way that we sweep these things under the rug. If you don't have someone that you can talk with about what happened to you and work through it, you could become bitter. You could walk away from Christ. You could adversely affect others. You could sabotage gospel initiatives. Victimization is a debilitating soul phenomenon, and it can happen to any of us. And so if you're coming out of an abusive relationship or an abusive context, then I appeal to you to find competent help. Many of the people in this interview, in this last episode, they talked about the help that they have received. Some people are still stuck in it and they're bitter by what happened to them. Other people have said, admittedly, that they have just walked away from Christianity altogether. But we have to talk about these things. And so where, when, why, and how we talk about it is important. But my appeal to you is, if you are part of a toxic, manipulative, authoritarian, abusive culture or relationship, that you cry out and that you find that help and you get the help that you need so it doesn't shipwreck your faith or damage other relationships in your life. Thank you so much for watching.